Good evening, tributes, and welcome back to Panem Reborn. I'd like to thank everyone who is associated with this series before we get started. So thank you to Christian Blanco, whose series Tales of the Hunger Games this series is based off of, and his channel is linked down below in the description. I'd also like to thank Andrew McLean, who provided a lot of the artwork used in this series. Thank you very much, Andrew, for giving me permission to use the artwork, and his blog is linked below as well. I'd also like to thank my editors, Octavian Stesia, Anna, and Ray B, and thank you so much for helping edit some of the earlier episodes of Panem Reborn. I really appreciated the help. So I don't think there's any other announcements, just please remember that after the 111th games, which I'll post next week, I'm going to be taking a break for mental health for at least several months, so just keep that in mind. I hope to return in the future, but just keep that in mind for now. So I don't think there's anything else, so let's dive into Panem for today. This year was known to all in Panem as the 7th quinquennial quell, the year of the 110th Hunger Games. Therefore, it was with great pride and honor that President Mace stepped up to the stage overlooking Mace Square and announced the special twist for this year. Many were curious, as the previous quinquennial quell had brought both great entertainment in the form of the Squirrel Companions, as well as a much-beloved victor, Heifer Muller. President Mace read aloud from the crisp slip of paper he was handed by an attendant, as a reminder that the actions of those imprisoned by the Capitol not only hurt them, but their loved ones as well. This year's tributes will be reaped from among the teenage relatives of political prisoners. This year's twist was eagerly anticipated by many Capitol citizens who felt that its prisoners, many of whom were taken into custody for resisting the Capitol's takeover following the Civil War, deserved to be taught a lesson about the consequences of their actions. One of the earlier reapings in the day was that of District 8, where Cornelia Creed, victor of the 109th Hunger Games, stepped up to the reaping bowls as soon as the mayor's speech concluded. She sported a fashionable lob this year after having cut her hair during her games, unlike last year during her own reaping, when waves of fiery hair had tumbled down her back. District 8 appeared even more run down and miserable than usual this year, especially as the only eligible tributes were some of its roughest citizens. The reaping pens were noticeably smaller this year and filled with an array of teenagers in ratty attire with equally dirty expressions on their faces. It was immediately clear to most Capitol viewers in Mace Square that the district would not be offering its best and brightest youths to the reaping for this quell. Cornelia Creed daintily drew a slip from the female reaping bowl, quietly tapping the microphone to ensure she could be heard and slightly fumbling the name of 18-year-old Zibbeline Charvet, a tall and reedy factory worker with greasy black hair and dark eyes. She glared down both the cameras and the peacekeepers that arrived to collect her, wiping a dye-stained hand on her dirty purple smock before offering it to an awkward-looking Cornelia, who tentatively accepted. Rosalia had been giving background information on the reaped tributes as they were called, reading aloud the names and crimes of their imprisoned relatives. At this time, Rosalia read aloud that Zibbeline's parents were imprisoned in the Capitol for starting an underground textile smuggling ring that operated in multiple districts across Panem, which siphoned off resources meant for the Capitol and had caused the death of several prominent Capitol officials and peacekeepers during warehouse raids. This crime was more strictly punished than usual due to the Charvet family having connections to radical organizations in District 15. For their role in the smuggling ring and killing of these officials, they were sentenced to life inside a maximum security unit. Their daughter glared coldly out at the rest of the district, almost as if daring anyone to challenge her. Cornelia then moved to the male reaping bowl and drew the name of 18-year-old Holland Clay, a thin boy with a smattering of freckles across his nose and soft gray eyes. Rosalia announced that he was the youngest brother of a family of black market morphling dealers who had just been apprehended and arrested the previous week during a covert operation. He appeared quite unsurprised at hearing his name as the male tribute, prompting Rosalia to comment that he seemed more like he had just witnessed paint drying than being reaped for the Hunger Games. Holland glanced ruefully around as a few other boys clapped him on the back before he was escorted to the front by peacekeepers, respectfully nodding to Zibbeline, who sighed in response and looked away. He accepted Cornelia's polite handshake, though he seemed afraid to even touch her hands for fear of ruining her pristine manicure. The pair from 8 were presented to the unenthusiastic crowd as being their representatives for this year in the games, rather sarcastically raising their arms together in unity before being escorted off the stage and permitted to see their families. Zibbeline greeted an aging grandmother with a weak hug, muttering something in low tones as she pressed her head to her grandmother's shoulder, while Holland bleakly smiled and gave side hugs to some of his close friends, as he had no family left in the district. They only had a few minutes to say their goodbyes before peacekeepers kicked open the doors and hauled them out to the train station to be transported to the capital. Zibbeline and Holland trudged onto the train, avoiding eye contact with each other as they sat on opposite ends of the carriage, Holland staring out the window by the lounge and Zibbeline raising a finger to request a shot of absinthe from the Avox tending the bar in the corner. A few minutes later, as the train began to roll off towards the capital, they were joined by their mentor, the perpetually inebriated Dario Ivers. He strolled in, surveying the scene and taking in Holland wistfully staring away, and Zibbeline smacking her lips after downing all of the absinthe in a single gulp. His irritable expression swiftly morphed into a gleeful grin as he threw his head back and jabbed a finger at Zibbeline while emitting a squawking laugh, declaring that he liked this one. Both tributes turned to stare at him in surprise, Holland anxiously lacing his fingers in front of him, and Zibbeline sheepishly grinning and whistling while attempting to conceal her shot glass behind her back. Dario sauntered over and gestured to them to join him at the dining table, motioning for a pair of Avoxes to bring out some appetizers for the group. Holland's eyes widened as he asked, "What's an appetizer?" in an amazed tone, and stared at the small plated dishes in the gloved hands of a series of Avoxes that swept around the table to serve each of the three. Dario looked at Holland as if he had four heads, and replied that he would describe it as a pre-dinner, to which Holland wrinkled his nose and laughed at the absurdity of this idea. Zibbeline continuously ordered a multitude of alcoholic drinks throughout their luncheon, though her poorly concealed efforts were quickly noticed by Dario and Holland. Dario waved off her behavior with a casual grin, but Holland appeared deeply perturbed, and he seemed no longer able to contain his frustration with her by the time they were offered dessert. Without warning, he stood, nearly knocking his chair over, and knocked her shot glass out of her hand with such force that it shattered all over the carpet and spilled liquid on the tablecloth as it fell. Zibbeline stood open-mouthed in shock and began to swell up and shake with fury, before deflating a moment later and storming off to her sleeping compartment. Dario made a yikes face at Holland, who sighed and apologized to the Avoxes for the mess before telling Dario he was grateful for his company, but that he would need to speak with Zibbeline privately. Dario waved him off and serenely ordered a Mai Tai from the nearest Avox, who was not occupied with cleaning up Zibbeline's spilled drink. Meanwhile, Holland carefully picked his way down the train and politely knocked on the door to Zibbeline's compartment, where she emerged a moment later with her hair in a towel turban, clearly appearing ready to get in the shower. He asked his district partner politely if he could come in, but she scowled and declined, stating that she did not wish to be spied upon in the shower and that he would need to take his peeping eyes elsewhere. Holland flushed bright red and hastened to correct himself, though a wry grin appeared on Zibbeline's face as she slammed the door on him before he could get out another word. The rest of the train ride passed rather uncomfortably, as Holland rejoined Dario in the main lounge area, and they watched reruns of the 102nd games, in which District 8 had made it all the way to the final two before barely losing to "that pesky girl from 3, as Dario put it, in the final fight. Zibbeline did not leave her compartment for the rest of the afternoon and evening, ordering room service for dinner, and only grudgingly stepping out to rejoin the group when Dario went to fetch her from her carriage to exit the train. The tension as the pair from 8 departed the train was almost tangible to those around them. Unlike tributes in ordinary games years, they made no attempt to gain the admiration or adoration of the gawking capitalites at the train station, both tributes crossing their arms and averting their eyes until Dario gave up on trying to convince them to smile. He then escorted the pair to a limousine to be taken to their apartment, sighing deeply and swigging from a hip flask while shaking his head. Arriving in their apartment and flopping down on the couch, Holland had just begun to flip through the television channels to see reaping coverage, when Zibbeline breezed past him and into her room, slamming the door shut. Dario appeared at a loss for what to do until this scene was interrupted by the arrival of District 8's capital stylist, Taryn Raby. She raised an eyebrow at Holland slumped on the couch and Dario staring at one of the bedroom doors before carefully unloading a scrapbook of outfit designs onto the nearest table and picking her way down the hallway to Zibbeline's door. After a moment in which she knocked on the door and a muffled response sounded from within, Dario and Holland looked on in amazement as she was allowed entry. A few uncomfortable minutes passed before Taryn and Zibbeline re-emerged from the latter's room, one of Taryn's arms gently guiding Zibbeline's back to the living room area. It appeared as though she had been crying, but neither of their male counterparts seemed too keen on asking. Taryn swiftly moved along the conversation by offering up the scrapbook to the group to view her designs, suggesting that her design of choice was the suit and gown made of a patchwork of many fabrics, both representing the products of their district and the many fabrics that allowed Panem to keep running smoothly. The patchwork descended in tiers of rainbow shades, creating an attractive spectacle of a costume. Both tributes were almost immediately intrigued by the stunning designs and eager to try them on. Dario seemed bored by the measurement and tailoring process, choosing to abandon his mentees until they were ready to be sent down for the parade, and instead heading out to the balcony for some fresh air. As Taryn sat her tributes down and a team of stylists swept in to prepare their hair and makeup, Holland slightly turned to Zibbeline and attempted to apologize, but a stylist turned his head the other way in order to apply foundation. After a few minutes of unsuccessfully trying to turn his head to talk to his district partner and being pulled back by increasingly impatient stylists, Taryn quietly stepped over to him and offered a piece of advice. Once hair and makeup were fully done and the pair were escorted into an elevator, Holland turned to Zibbeline and very frankly apologized for the incident on the train. The conversation that followed was unintelligible to cameras as it was conducted in quiet tones, but Zibbeline raised her head and respectfully nodded to Holland. He later revealed in a conversation with Dario at the tribute apartment that he had a certain sensitivity to seeing drunken individuals after a personal experience, and Zibbeline's drinking had set him off, but that he had explained his sensitivity to her, and they had agreed to shake off the incident. The pair continued down to the parade, talking to each other in hushed tones for the first time since they had been reaped. While the pair from 8 were on the train, Cornelia Creed arrived in District 3 to perform this year's reapings. After a brief speech from the mayor, she surveyed the gathered youths with a sad, almost sympathetic smile, and turned to the female reaping bowl. Daintily slipping a piece of paper from the bowl, Cornelia read out the name of 17-year-old Tinker Bellander, the sister of a well-known hacker that had compromised Capitol's social media a few years prior and released some sensitive photos of top Capitol officials, including President Mace, frequenting a bordello in District 15. A dark-haired girl with a frizzy afro and dark eyes, magnified several times by a large pair of metallic goggles, crossed her arms and swiped at her running nose with a finger before allowing the peacekeepers to drag her to the front. Cornelia seemed hesitant to shake hands with her due to having watched the girl wipe her nose with it a moment prior, but instead awkwardly patted Tinker on the shoulder and turned to the male reaping bowl. She then drew the name of 14-year-old Wolfram Schneider from the bowl, as Rosalia narrated in the background commentary that he was related to several members of a cryptocurrency counterfeiting ring within District 3 that had caused a stir in the Capitol by performing a virtual heist on a bank frequented by some of the most elite Capitolites in high society. A short boy with light brown hair, oil-streaked cheeks, and vaguely amber eyes was dragged to the front by peacekeepers, though he made an irritated expression as one of them yanked on his arm slightly too hard. He shook Cornelia's hand so vigorously that her entire arm swung up and down for a moment before joining the indifferent Tinker at the front of the stage. The pair were declared this year's tributes for District 3 as they were led away to briefly meet with their families and depart for the train station. Tinker exchanged some quick words and hugs with the rest of her family minus her imprisoned brother, while Wolfram spoke with some extended family members and was clapped on the back before the pair were hauled off to the train station, with hardly a moment's notice. Wolfram and Tinker entered the train to find a lunch spread already laid out for them and 3 place settings. Occupying the head of the table was their mentor, Lena Siragon, serenely braiding her hair and regarding them with a careful expression. She patted the table as if inviting them to sit down at the other seats, and continued to survey them, to the point where Tinker nervously adjusted her goggles and Wolfram sheepishly scratched at the back of his neck. After a few moments of silence, Lena suddenly stood up and grinned. She raised an arm, called out, "Think fast!" and hurled a buttered biscuit at Tinker's head. Tinker yelped and dived out of the way, while Wolfram reached out and grabbed the biscuit before popping it into his mouth. Lena applauded both her tributes for their quick reactions, remarking that they would certainly need to use these skills in the games, and encouraged them to sit and eat. Both tributes enthusiastically tore into an array of meats, cheeses, vegetables, and fruits, before both Tinker and Wolfram simultaneously turned their sights on the bread pudding at the center. To Lena's horror, they descended upon the pudding with such force and intensity that it splattered on the tablecloth, and even slightly on her lemon-lime lace dress. Lena sighed and snapped her fingers for an Avox to clear the table and hand her a napkin for her dress, standing up once more and beckoning her tributes to follow her over to the lounge area in the compartment. Once there, she invited them to sit and began what she dubbed Lena Boot Camp, lecturing her tributes on all aspects of the games. She reminded Tinker and Wolfram that her own mentor had said on the train ride to the Capitol during her games that no shenanigans would be tolerated, and echoed this sentiment now to her own mentees. Wolfram raised his hand and she poked a finger at him as if calling on him in a school classroom, though he admitted a moment later that he had forgotten his question. Lena raised an eyebrow and continued on, stating that just because her tributes were related to Capitol prisoners did not mean they had an excuse to act like baboons in the Capitol, and that they would still want to win over audiences to receive sponsorships. As soon as she finished lecturing the tributes, she tossed a book about advanced electromagnetics into Tinker's hand and plopped Wolfram down across from her at a chess table to test his skills. While Tinker thumbed through the book with mild, albeit slightly confused, interest, Lena announced to Wolfram that she had become quite the chess player on her frequent train rides to and from the capital and wanted to see how his mind worked. She promised Tinker that she would also test her ability if there was time. To Lena's shock, Wolfram casually checkmated her within only a few minutes, sending her king tumbling to the ground and rolling under the dining table. As an Avox retrieved the piece and returned it to Lena, she stared at Wolfram with newfound appreciation and declared, "Beginner's luck," before placing all the pieces back on the board and calling a rematch. This time, Wolfram beat her even quicker, even playing some portions of the game with his eyes closed. Lena gaped in astonishment and asked how he was so good. Wolfram simply smiled and replied that he was a Schneider, as he sent Lena's king flying once more. Tinker struggled much more with chess, but quickly impressed Lena with the tiny devices she was able to fashion from everyday objects around the train compartment, and it appeared that the tributes had thoroughly impressed her with their hidden skills. Just as Lena commented to Tinker and Wolfram that she had much higher hopes for her district now than at the reaping, the train pulled into Maze Station and their conversation was cut off by the curious murmurs of the capital citizens outside. Lena squared her shoulders and wiped her mentees' faces with a napkin to remove the grease and oil, reminding them to keep their heads up and smile, even if they were nervous. With a small smile, she embraced them both in a tight hug before they stepped off the train. The capital crowd goggled at the tributes and their mentor as they stepped out, with many seemingly taken aback by their unusually clean appearances. Lena seemed satisfied by their surprise and graciously acknowledged the scattered cheering that accompanied her entrance. In fact, she grinned and muttered to her tributes that there was nothing better than seeing their jaws drop. After a few minutes of idle chat with the nearest startled capitalites to the group, Lena swept her mentees away to a limousine to be taken to their tribute apartment. Upon arriving at their apartment, Lena and the pair from 3 settled themselves around the central dining table and awaited the arrival of their stylist, Florizel Gamp. When at last he arrived, edging between 2 Avoxes and trying to avoid bumping face first into several furniture items around the room, he greeted the tributes and their mentor with a slightly sour look. It was quite clear that Florizel and Lena were not on the friendliest of terms after the fashion disaster he created for her games, and that they were only making a very strained effort to be polite to each other. Nevertheless, Florizel showed his battery-inspired jumpsuits to Wolfram and Tinker, who appeared excited at the bright colors and flickering bolts of electricity at the tops of the outfits. Making a pointed remark about not tripping on these costumes like Lena had tripped on him a few years back, to Lena's consternation, Florizel made Tinker and Wolfram spin around so he could get a full view of the costumes. He then handed them each a small wrist strap with a tiny remote attached to it, instructing them to hit the green button on the front. They did as told and quickly began to giggle as their hair flew up in a spiky, frizzy mess, as Florizel revealed the costumes had delivered a small dose of static electricity to their hair. As several stylists rushed in to fix their hair, Tinker and Wolfram pointed at each other and continued to laugh at their wild hairdos. Even Lena had to grudgingly admit that the costumes were quite striking. As soon as their hair and makeup was complete, Lena shooed her tributes out the door to the elevator. Tinker and Wolfram made quiet conversation on the way down to the tribute parade, smiling a little bit at each other's hair continuing to frizz up and speculating about the other tributes. The start of the tribute parade brought a great buzz of interest to the gathered capital crowd and viewers around Panem. There was a few minutes' delay at the start, which Rosalia Sanchez quickly explained was due to an argument that had broken out among some tributes over their parade costumes and was being resolved by peacekeepers. Notably, when the parade was green-lighted to continue once more, Husker from 9 sported a black eye, and Montpellier from 6 had scratch marks across his exposed arm. Tinker and Wolfram's eyes nearly bugged out of their heads as they saw the capital crowd for the first time, stiffly waving their hands as Tinker's goggles slipped down from her forehead and landed on the bridge of her nose. Wolfram nudged his district partner and reminded her to turn on their costumes, sending jolts of electricity up through their hair and creating the same spiky effect as earlier. Combined with their dark makeup and the tiny lightning streaks painted on their cheeks, the tributes made an intimidating impact on both the audience and some of their other tributes. Rosalia remarked that this was a far cry from the geeky pair she had seen at the reaping, and expressed her excitement to see how they would fare in the arena and with sponsors. Meanwhile, Holland and Zibbeline had made quite the opposite impression on viewers, who were dazzled by their flowing patchwork outfits and serene expressions. During the parade, Holland quirked a grin and whispered something to Zibbeline that temporarily turned her boredom to amusement, and they continued to exchange small jokes throughout the parade, allowing their beautiful costumes to do most of the talking for them, as was common with District 8. However, it was noted that they refused to wave to the crowd or even interact with them at all, seemingly as a form of protest, though Rosalia Sanchez smartly refrained from mentioning this during her commentary and dismissed it as needing some time to warm up. President Mace made his yearly speech and included a small joke this year about tributes not scratching each other up before the games, evidently referencing Husker and Montpellier. Later, it was revealed that the cause of the parade fight was alleged to be when Montpellier jokingly called Husker's costume corny, to which the other boy fired back that he would rather drive off a cliff in than wear Montpellier's car-inspired costume. Fortunately, there were no more altercations for the rest of the parade, and Camilo Anderson was pleased to announce on live coverage that District 3 had won the coveted Anderson Fashion Best Dressed title with their electrifying costumes and hair. Upon this announcement being relayed to the tributes at the conclusion of the parade, Beatrix from 2 tossed the laurel wreath off her head and began viciously stamping it into the ground in outrage, resulting in Cordelia Breen commenting, "That probably explains why her cousins were arrested for assault and battery." The District 3 tributes were greeted and embraced by Lena and Florizel after the parade, their mentor and stylist decked out in party hats and loudly tooting on noisemakers to celebrate their best-dressed win. Lena sent them to bed soon after, holding a bottle of champagne just out of her tribute's reach to avoid them having any alcohol before training the next day, but secretly popping it and downing half the bottle in a single gulp while smacking her lips when no one else was looking. Several floors above in the District 8 apartment, Taryn embraced the tributes and told them that they still had looked stunning despite not winning Best Dressed. Well, Dario clapped them both on the back with such gusto that Zibbeline almost fell over. He sent them off to bed a few minutes later, reminding them that they would need to show up for training the next morning. Gloria Steele presided over training as usual this year, carrying an extra-large water cannon to celebrate the occasion of a quell. Evidently, she had been suspicious at the lack of a need to use her smaller water cannon in previous years, and especially considering the incident at the parade, she wanted to show up extra prepared for any situation in which she would have to discipline a tribute by blasting ice-cold water into their face. The rules were read aloud as usual, and the tributes quickly separated to work at their own stations. Unlike most years, this year's tributes seemed wary of each other and stuck to only working with their district partners, which Rosalia theorized was because of their distrust of each other's family backgrounds. The sole exception was the traditional career pack, who worked together at stations like most years. Some, like Torius from 2, were only reaped because of their family's white-collar crimes. His family had been political opponents of Gloria Steele's when the districts were still autonomous, meaning one of her first recommendations to President Gall was to jail them. It was also noted that Gloria kept a sharp eye on Torius throughout the training proceedings, water cannon always cocked and at the ready. As for the tributes themselves, the careers allied with each other as usual, while the pairs from 4 and 7 appeared to be working closely once more, and the rest of the districts scattered to work in pairs. Holland and Zibbeline breezed through a variety of snare-setting and net-making activities, but appeared to have a struggle at the survival stations, and Zibbeline reportedly spent several minutes arguing with a trainer at the edible insect identification station about how all of the insects looked the same. They finally moved on to the weapons station once Holland convinced Zibbeline to drop the subject and move along. Wolfram and Tinker worked closely together at almost all stations, struggling at most of the weaponry stations but picking up many survival skills rather quickly. The 3 days of training passed without incident, possibly due to the threat of Gloria Steele's water cannon looming over the tributes more than ever, and soon the tributes were preparing to present their skills for the game makers. Gloria seemed almost disappointed that no tributes had acted out this year, and thus she did not get to use her water cannon, but reluctantly turned the tributes over to the game maker team for their skill evaluations. Early on in the evaluation lineup was Wolfram, who put his hands on his hips and entered with a determined expression. As usual, Illicit Evaluation Reporting announced this year that he had engineered a fully functional Tesla coil and demonstrated its lightning effects to the amazement and delight of the game makers. Tinker went after and constructed a working battery for the game makers out of a potato, a few wires, and a light bulb. While the game makers had clearly found this stunt amusing, it still did not score too well, as they commented that it was unlikely a tribute would ever find themselves in a situation in which they would need to construct a battery from vegetables and wires in the arena. Further on, Holland wove a net so tight that not even water could leak out, while Zibbeline stitched together a tourniquet from her own shirt sleeves in a matter of seconds. The scores for all tributes were released later in the evening. Beatrix from 2 and Rudolph from 4 had tied for the highest scores at 10, followed by Torius from 2 and the pair from 1, all at 9. Wolfram had scored an 8 for his impressive coil, Tinker had earned a 6, Holland had earned a 7, and Zibbeline had earned a 6 for their skills, respectively. Lena cheered her mentees for their middling scores, saying at least they weren't twos, while Dario threw back his head and simply laughed at his mentees' scores, causing them to exchange confused looks. The interviews were conducted the following evening with Rosalia, who arrived to the studios in a striking black and white checkered dress, leading audiences to murmur about how it signified an aspect of this year's arena. However, she wasted no time in greeting the crowd and inviting in her first interviewee of the night. After all of the career's interviews flew by without raising any eyebrows, Tinker was brought on stage, wearing a circuit board pattern dress. Her goggles had been temporarily removed and replaced with contacts for the purpose of avoiding glare from the cameras, revealing her wide, dark eyes underneath. She seemed terrified to be so directly under public scrutiny, though Rosalia's gentle questioning soon refocused her attention on the interview. Unlike some of the career tributes thus far, there were no funny stories or joking associated with the reason behind Tinker's reaping, especially because it was quite clear that Rosalia had been instructed to stay away from the topic of the compromising photos of President Mason France that had been leaked by Tinker's brother Widget. Instead, she shyly talked to Rosalia about her passion for building and working with small contraptions, as she worked in a factory doing assembly line work in her daily life. This endeared Tinker to the audience, with many capitalites comparing her to their own inventive children, and one mother even tearing up as Tinker reminded her of her own scientifically inclined daughter studying at the academy. After Tinker's interview was concluded and she graciously skittered off the stage, Wolfram was brought in, though he seemed to be slightly drowning in his too large circuit board suit. Yet this did not deter him from swooping in and grinning before dramatically kissing Rosalia's hand and bowing. The Capitol audience burst into laughter as Rosalia raised a surprised eyebrow and remarked to him that she appreciated the eagerness, but that he was many years too young and several inches too short for her. Despite his embarrassing rejection, he made a strong impression on viewers throughout the rest of his interview and revealed publicly for the first time that he was a descendant of the second incarnation's Gift Schneider, victor of the 91st Hunger Games. The audience was delighted to hear this and began buzzing with anticipation as soon as he said it. Wolfram's age and his smaller frame proved to be no obstacle to charming the crowd, even if they had not charmed Rosalia, and he exited the stage victoriously after being cheered and applauded. Several more tributes down the line, Zibbeline arrived on stage in a sour mood after an alleged dispute with Dario Ivers about the revealing nature of her purple satin dress, which was intended to make a sharp V shape with the sleeves arching down to meet at her navel, but instead looked droopy and misshapen on her scrawny body. She continually adjusted the dress throughout her interview, which went rather poorly and resulted in her becoming enraged at Rosalia for joking about her parents' defunct smuggling ring and repeatedly mispronouncing her name as Zibbeline. Frustrated, she then told Rosalia that her dress made her look like a confused zebra and stormed off stage, refusing to complete the interview. Rosalia made a hasty joke about Zibbeline having woken up on the wrong side of her bed that morning and moved on by welcoming Holland on stage in his brilliant purple suit. He smiled graciously and immediately appeared as a stark contrast to Zibbeline with his easy grace and polite attitude during the interview. Rosalia pressed him on a variety of topics from his family history to his home life, and he answered all with calm and precise responses. However, when she jokingly asked how he managed to tolerate his district partner's temper, Holland clammed up and refused to dignify the question with a response, sparking murmurs of interest and confusion from viewers in the Capitol audience. Rosalia hesitantly ended the interview, and Holland was applauded by the audience, who considered him a gentleman for not speaking ill of his partner. The tributes had all been sent off to bed soon after the interviews ended, anxiously waiting for the chaos of the following morning. When they awoke and were escorted down to the lunchrooms, they quickly learned that the tribute outfits for this year were quite unconventional. Instead of cargo pants or parkas, they were each given slim, checkered jumpsuits and sleek black sneakers, as well as black visor-like goggles. Tinker appeared irritated to have to remove her own goggles in order to wear these. Zibbeline grumbled to Dario that she did not like the prison uniform, though he simply sighed and told her to get in her launch tube. Tinker and Wolfram were both wished good luck by Lena, who gave them each a firm hug and smiled proudly. Dario visited Holland after Zibbeline and shook his hand, encouraging him to charm the Capitol and win over hearts. Without further ado, the countdown began and the podium slowly began to rise into the arena. The tributes stared around in shock at their surroundings as their podiums rose up, as this arena was unlike any they had ever expected or witnessed before in past games. The 24 podiums rose up around the center of what appeared to be an enormous chessboard. The sky around them was pitch black despite it being late morning, lending an eerie sensation of isolation to the tribute's existing discomfort and nerves. Yet each chess piece on the board was not just a decoration. Every single piece on the board was a building in itself. waiting for the tributes to seek out its mysteries. Some tributes, particularly those on the younger side, began to panic at the frightening detail and intensity of the chess piece buildings. Holland and Zibbeline exchanged troubled looks from their podiums as they tried to determine if there was a safe place to run. Tinker immediately began scanning the area for opportunities, while Wolfram squinted and tried to see what was in the cornucopia. There was no food or water, but there were many weapons in the form of sharpened, foot-long chess pieces that glinted even from the tribute's starting positions. During the countdown, head game makers Locke and Locke recited in unison their vision for this year's games. They explained that for the Quell, they had chosen to construct the games based off the theme of the mythical four horsemen of the apocalypse from ancient texts before Panem. This theme would not only factor into the arena itself, but into the entire format of the games. The aspects of the four horsemen, famine, plague, war, and death, would each play a role in the arena proceedings. The head game makers announced that they had already gifted the tributes with a starting reminder of the theme, specifically famine, in that no food or water was present in the cornucopia. If tributes wished to obtain it, they would need to be creative. The countdown reached 0 as the tributes continued to panic and wildly stare around, the head game maker's message completely going over their heads. Most found themselves unwilling to risk a conflict at the cornucopia, especially bearing in mind the events of last year's bloodbath, and sprinted away. This group included Holland, Zibbeline, Tinker, and Wolfram, who all fled into the black side of Chess City under cover of the mass exodus away from the cornucopia. In fact, so few tributes moved toward the cornucopia this year that the careers easily laid claim to its contents without much contest. They still managed to put on a bloodbath show for the capital, with Beatrix from 2 smashing the skulls of the girl from 6 and the girl from 15 against each other as they tried to run away. Behind her, the pair from 1 snapped the neck of Tallulah from 10. Torius from 2 jammed the top of a lethal miniature chess rook into Husker from 9's head, sending blood spurting everywhere and adding a spray of red to the careers' checkered arena outfits. However, the careers soon discovered that all of the remaining tributes had dispersed, and they could not hunt for others without risking being vastly outnumbered and ambushed by this year's particularly gritty outliers. Thus, by the end of the slightly underwhelming bloodbath, there were still hardly any deaths, and the cornucopia area was eerily quiet. Over on the black side of Chess City, Holland and Zibbeline had sprinted into a bishop-shaped building and were running up the spiral staircase inside, eyes darting around. There were no windows, and the building was dimly lit, so it was nearly impossible for them to tell if there were other tributes or hazards lurking nearby. They briefly stopped to rest every few hundred feet, but kept heading upward in order to avoid being pursued. At last, after nearly an hour of climbing, they reached another floor. Zibbeline fell forward and collapsed onto the floor, while Holland looked around and noticed that they appeared to be in an observation deck of some kind, with a long window along the far wall that looked out at some of the other buildings in the black sector, and many in the white sector. After a few seconds of gazing out the window, Holland turned to his conked-out district partner and chuckled a bit to himself, asking her if she was all right. Zibbeline grumpily muttered back that she regretted smoking for a few years back in District 8, to which Holland gave a scandalized look and reprimanded her for damaging her health in such a way. Still face down on the floor, Zibbeline made an obscene hand gesture at Holland, to his amusement. He stepped over and helped her up with a hand, continuing to look around and pointing out to her that while the room seemed empty, there seemed to be some sort of carving on the wall. Zibbeline peered at it and ran her hand along the carving, while Holland poked his head around the window and tried to check if there was anything notable in the arena that could be seen from their vantage point. The pair struggled to gain their bearings, seemingly disoriented by the darkness on the observation deck and their exhausting climb up the stairs. Zibbeline smacked her hand against the mysterious carvings on the wall in frustration and slid down to the ground, grumbling irritably, as Holland reminded her that they had plenty of time to figure it out. Over inside one of the Black Knight pieces, Wolfram and Tinker appeared rather overwhelmed. Right inside the doors to the building was a simple black room, unlit and appearing to stretch into the distance. The pair glanced at each other and stepped forward, only to find that they had walked directly into a wall. Rubbing their heads and groaning in unison, they felt along the wall and were surprised to discover that there was some sort of map on the wall that could only be felt and not seen in the darkness. Placing their hands strategically on the walls and feeling their way around, they tried to follow the path they believed to be outlined and ended up smacking into each other. Disentangling themselves, Tinker quietly remarked that they must have been following the path wrong and urged Wolfram to leave the building with her, as there was no time to waste and other tributes were still out and about. However, Wolfram insisted on figuring out the wall carvings, and they continued trying to follow the various branching paths outlined across the walls, all the while glancing around anxiously for any sign of other tributes hiding nearby. At last, they managed to trace their way to a hidden wall panel, which swung open when Tinker accidentally bonked her head into it. Wolfram stumbled backward and pointed excitedly, sprinting forward into the foreboding space before them, while Tinker followed behind, still rubbing her head and grimacing. All viewers could hear at this time was a shout of, "Whoa!" and a loud bang. The rest of the afternoon and evening passed fairly quietly in the arena for most. All tributes except for the group of careers that had been sponsored a small feast's worth of capital delicacies began to become irritable over their lack of food. Holland and Zibbeline continued to keep a lookout at the window in their hideout and tried to comprehend the carvings on the wall while working through their rumbling stomachs. Suddenly, Zibbeline painfully stubbed her toe on something on the floor and yelped, uttering a string of profanities. Holland turned and asked in a concerned tone what happened, to which she pointed to the offending protrusion. Holland stepped over to the spot on the ground and inspected it carefully, running his fingers over it. Zibbeline refused to even look at it, throwing it a dirty look and nursing her painful toe. A moment later, Holland leaped up and cried out with a jolt of surprise. He ran a finger along the patch of floor and traced what he found to be letters that formed words. He then read these aloud to Zibbeline as they both seemed startled by the unexpected discovery. Holland murmured the words from the raised plaque. "You've found a secret, now get to the crown. The walls are a deflection, the real path is down." Both tributes furrowed their brows in confusion and attempted to decipher the message, muttering "down," "crown," "secret," before Holland casually rested his hand on the floor plaque and leaned back to stretch. Without warning, the floor beneath them retracted, and they plummeted down into the murky blackness below. The only sound captured by cameras was Zibbeline's strained scream. Cameras in the new room that Tinker and Wolfram had entered revealed that the bang that had occurred was from Wolfram accidentally knocking an item off a shelf in the room when they walked in, while the whoa had come from Tinker. They both stared around at the dimly lit room ahead of them, filled with towering shelves of items. These items ranged from sharpened chess pieces identical to the ones in the cornucopia, to a tiny glass bottle with a currant cake on a plate next to it, to an entire shelving unit covered in large puzzle boxes. While Tinker sat down and began eagerly delving into the puzzle boxes, Wolfram stared around with suspicion. His stomach growled loudly and he held a hand to it, staring hungrily at the currant cake. While Tinker casually continued attempting to solve one of the puzzle boxes, he gobbled down the entire thing in a single bite and sipped from the tiny bottle next to it. Viewers in Mace Square gasped, believing he had possibly ingested some type of poison from the suspiciously unguarded food and drink, but instead he simply sat down on the ground with a mildly dazed expression and reached his hand out as if feeling to make sure everything around him was still there. He continued doing this for several minutes, confusing many viewers. Tinker gave a shout of delight as she succeeded in opening the puzzle box, though her delight soon turned to a shriek of alarm as a number of tiny, moving, whirring objects emerged from within. These were seen to be mechanized chess pieces, zooming around the floor and causing Tinker to giggle. However, Wolfram appeared afraid for the first time and yelped, backing right into a shelf. It careened back and forth for a moment before falling forward, sending more oddities crashing into the ground and creating a domino effect of bookshelves smashing into each other and their contents spilling all around. The tributes from 3 dived for cover, though Wolfram was still jabbing a finger at the skittering chess pieces and muttering something incomprehensible. Tinker looked at him with concern, though he shook his head and seemed to be grappling with something internally that she did not want to disturb. She glanced with grim distrust at the plate where the currant cake and small bottle of liquid had been, taking Wolfram's hand and pulling him along with her to the far side of the room. As they crossed over into a dark hallway, they heard a deep rumbling, deep as the arena itself, followed by the grating sounds of an entire building collapsing. Holland and Zibbeline tumbled onto a dark, velvet-cushioned floor a long ways below their previous hideout and watched with bewilderment as the top of the tower was resealed away from them. Zibbeline was the first to get up, gruffly dusting off her hands and helping Holland to his feet. Neither of them had suffered any major injuries due to the soft cushioning on the floor, though Holland nursed a sprained ankle. She supported him in getting up and moving towards a far side of the circular landing space as they continued to mull over the mysterious message from the floor above. The pair laughed wryly at the down portion of the message, figuring that it referred to the tumble they had just taken after Holland accidentally pressed on the floor plaque, and they found the portions about finding a secret and the walls being deceiving to have been self-explanatory. Yet they could not understand the part in the message about getting to the crown, worrying that they would have to find a way to exit the building somehow and go back to the top to reread the message. Fortunately for the pair, Zibbeline found and pointed out an archway leading into further darkness, which they headed into with a last unsettled glance around. As they did so, they too heard the great rumbling and clamor of a building collapsing, prompting Holland to pale and Zibbeline to narrow her eyes suspiciously. Though many tributes like the pairs from 3 and 8 did not know it, a pawn building on the white side of the arena had crumbled in on itself, trapping inside and killing Kalina from 7 and the boy from 11. Their cannons could not be heard by any other tributes due to the commotion from the building, leaving 18 tributes remaining as the first, night, fell over the already darkened arena and their portraits flashed across the pure black sky. Wolfram and Tinker entered the dark hall behind the shelf room, relieved to find it was devoid of any more hidden wall panels or shelves filled with oddities. Feeling secure, they settled down on the smooth ground and peacefully slept there for the night, though Wolfram's body seemed to convulse slightly as he slept. Under the Black Bishop building, Holland and Zibbeline had begun to yawn, but they continued to walk ahead into the darkened tunnels. Strangely, unlike the observation deck and cushioned room so far, these tunnels had dim torches lighting the walls every 50 feet, allowing them some ability to see as they made their way forward. Still supporting the slightly injured Holland as they shuffled along, Zibbeline noted aloud that they had come across a clearing with 3 different tunnels. All 3 tunnels were completely dark, but Holland insisted that he could see something at the far end of the leftmost tunnel. Zibbeline raised an eyebrow and asked if he was sure or if he was seeing things, to which he offered a cross look and limped forward without her help. She reluctantly followed, sighing, and they continued down the hall. However, they once again encountered a clearing, this time with 6 tunnels. At this time, Zibbeline shook her head and insisted they rest for the night. For once, the pair agreed on a course of action, and the night passed smoothly for all of the 18 remaining tributes. The pair from 8 had impressed Capital viewers throughout the day with their stamina and endurance despite having no food since the early morning, while the pair from 3 sparked interest from viewers in what they might be up to next. The following morning dawned bright and early with a blaring, obnoxious noise that sounded across the arena and a loud announcement from the head game makers. They declared to the drowsy tributes that while many of them seemed to be experiencing the effects of the famine portion of the Quell twist, there was not enough suffering happening, and they wanted to see more. They then revealed the second twist of the Quell for this year, relating to the second Horseman of Pestilence. Starting in 10 minutes' time, the arena would be flooded with a deadly disease, a mutated strain of the measles epidemic that had struck the capital during the events of the 100th Hunger Games. Any tributes that did not obtain a protective gas mask from the cornucopia in time would be infected and killed by the disease in a matter of minutes. Instantly, there was a panic all around the arena as the scattered tributes hastened to move toward the cornucopia area. Naturally, the couriers seized upon the masks and began gouging their chest-piece weapons into the eye holes to prevent other tributes from being able to use them. The flood of tributes that spilled into the cornucopia clearing created a pile-up around the gas mask table, amid a panicked flurry of hair-pulling and brutal punching. The gas masks flew around from tribute to tribute, even the damaged ones, as they vied for their protection. Lumen from 5 was trampled to death by a stampede of outlying tributes as he tried to snag a gas mask off the table, sending the mask flying and a cannon echoing over the chaos. Gabriel from 15 was pummeled by the pair from 1 down into the ground as they stabbed their chest-piece weapons into his neck and head. Beatrix landed a vicious punch to the face of the girl from 5, sending spittle flying and knocking out her teeth while grinning maliciously. She then slit the girl's throat with the choppy blades of her sharpened rook sword and turned around, eyes wide with excitement. During the chaos, Tinker and Wolfram frantically hurried back the way they had entered their building and out onto the central plaza, holding hands to keep track of each other and sliding smoothly on the ground between the legs of Rudolph from 4 as they sought a pair of gas masks. Tinker managed to snatch a pair from the bodies of Gabriel and the girl from 5, skidding on the linoleum ground and taking advantage of the chaos to steer them right back into their building and all the way to the secret hallway behind the shelving room. Wolfram had been gashed by a stray chest-piece weapon along the way, but seemed to not be severely injured, and thus both of them were able to put on the undamaged masks. On the other hand, even as the chaos began to escalate along with the tribute's desperation, the pair from 8 found themselves facing a difficult situation ahead. Zibbeline told Holland he was in no state to be running or fighting, insisting on retrieving both their masks on her own and bringing one back to him despite the risk. Holland reluctantly agreed, wincing in pain at his injured ankle. Zibbeline deposited him in the second tunnel clearing and sprinted back into the velvet-cushioned room, scanning the area for a way to get out other than from falling into it. Finding none, she threw herself against the wall in frustration and, to her surprise, heard a tiny cracking noise. On a hunch, she moved the special visor goggles they had been given from her forehead to her eyes and immediately shouted with excitement. The goggles sharpened everything in the room, allowing her to see that the walls were not made of solid metal as they had originally thought, but of a thin, tinted glass. Zibbeline continued throwing herself against the walls and progressively heard more cracking until she finally folded up the goggles and stabbed them through the glass, creating a fist-sized hole. She stabbed through more and more holes until there was just enough room for her torso to fit through the glass, which she then did carefully and attempted not to get covered in glass shards. Rolling out onto the linoleum ground and sprinting toward the cornucopia, Zibbeline was accosted by the pair from 4 almost instantly and dived downward, sliding right between their snatching hands and into the center of a large fight. The fight was over the few remaining masks, several of which were damaged or torn. Zibbeline looked around to identify the easiest target and settled on Montpellier from 6, who was brawling with Amber from 9 over a mask. Wading into the fight, Zibbeline reached her toned arms out and seized Amber by the zipper, slamming her into Montpellier and sending the surprisingly undamaged mask flying out of their hands and into her own. Montpellier grabbed onto Zibbeline's jumpsuit from behind and ripped at it with such force that it tore, exposing her bra underneath to all of Panem. Zibbeline growled and socked him in the face in response. Beatrix looked over to see this spectacle occurring and snickered at Zibbeline's indecent attire, asking if she was there to fight in the games or dance in an illegal burlesque, which angered the nearby girl from 1, whose sister had been arrested for being one such dancer and who took great offense to the statement. The two girls began bickering, allowing Zibbeline to duck underneath them and seize another mask from Beatrix's hand. She skittered out of the line of fire and back to the Black Bishop building, checking behind her every so often to ensure no other tributes were following and diving through the small hole in the glass. The lucky tributes around the arena who had obtained undamaged gas masks pressed them to their faces as the clock ticked down. Tinker and Wolfram high-fived as they placed their masks on and prepared to wait out the event, as Zibbeline sprinted all the way to Holland and shoved the masks over both their faces and breathed a sigh of relief. The brawl at the cornucopia area continued as Beatrix slapped a mask out of the hands of Murray from 10 and promptly tripped and fell on a pile-up of other tributes still desperately vying for one of the other 5 remaining masks. Her district partner, Torius, attempted to grab one of the other masks, but she scowled and jabbed a finger at it, angrily reminding him that it was one of the ones they had tampered with earlier. Smacking her head and complaining that she was the only one with any brains in the alliance, Beatrix kicked several tributes so hard that they fell off the pile-up and seized 3 masks for her allies. Just as the couriers fitted the masks over their heads, a gong rang out over the arena and the deadly measles strain seeped in from all sides. Though it was invisible, all of the fearful tributes left without a gas mask soon found themselves coughing and choking, red rashes blooming across their skin. Beatrix casually leaned against the cornucopia and waggled her fingers at the maskless tributes as if waving goodbye, though the other 3 couriers seemed more compassionate and politely looked away. Amber spat at Beatrix's feet as she lay dying and called her an insulting name, to which Beatrix grinned and responded, "At least you're bowing down, like you should be," before kicking her in the ribcage. Amber's cannon sounded seconds later, and Beatrix examined her nails with a smug expression. 3 more cannons rang throughout the arena, signifying that Montpellier from 6, Murray from 10, and Pepper from 11 had all succumbed to the disease, though it was noted that Pepper died with a shocked expression on her face as she realized the face mask she had succeeded in obtaining had a hole punctured in it by the couriers. Suddenly, there was a shout of alarm and a chorus of wheezing coughs as the cameras turned to focus on the masked couriers. Torius and the pair from 1 clawed at their masks in agony as Beatrix slowly turned with her face obscured in shadow, but the hint of a dark smile visible. The 3 other couriers collapsed to the ground as it became apparent to viewers that she had obtained 3 damaged masks for them. As they lay in front of her, she inhaled with a deep sense of satisfaction and listened to the sounds of their cannons with relish. She then sprinted away, allowing several hovercrafts to sweep in and collect the bodies of the deceased behind her. Meanwhile, the other remaining 7 tributes sheltered in place with their gas masks and exhaled sighs of relief when head game makers Lock and Lock announced around the arena that it was safe to remove the masks. However, they did not stop at the end of this announcement and reminded tributes that there were more than 2 horsemen. At the conclusion of this ominous statement, there was a loud rumbling that sounded like a thunderclap, followed by a white bishop building collapsing in on itself. There were no tributes inside this building, a fact noticed by Wolfram, who had been listening intently for the sound of a cannon amid the crashing. He furrowed his brow, but quickly refocused when Tinker asked if he felt all right. He nodded in response, but continued to stare vacantly at a space on the hallway wall behind her as if calculating something. Tinker grabbed his hand and tugged him along with her to the unexplored part of the hallway, reminding him that the collapsing buildings were likely part of the game maker's ploy to disorient the tributes and kill more of them off. Clutching their gas masks, the pair scampered down a winding staircase in the end of the hallway, struggling to see in the dark stairwell. They found themselves, surprisingly, in front of another door, just like the one they had entered to get inside the building. However, unlike the first door, this one was locked from the inside with a strange mechanism that was difficult to discern in the darkness. The pair railed weakly on the door for a few moments before falling to the floor, giving out from the exertion of the past 2 days and their own lack of food. At this time, a small sponsor gift floated down, which the pair eagerly unwrapped. Inside was a small packet of crackers, which they devoured within seconds. Underneath the crackers was another, tinier package, which Wolfram pocketed without Tinker's knowledge as she rubbed her stomach appreciatively. Yet as he examined the package under cover of the shadowy stairwell, he seemed dissatisfied upon realizing that it could not help them unlock the door. Giving up for the night, the pair quickly fell asleep after eating, knocking out before even the portraits of the fallen were projected to all of the tributes. Holland and Zibbeline heaved with relief as they removed their masks for the night and discussed their options for the next morning, though they were so fatigued and hungry that they could do little more than whisper weakly. After just a few minutes of chatting, Zibbeline's soft snores could be heard from the dim center of the second tunnel clearing. Holland seemed startled that his district partner had fallen asleep so quickly, but chuckled to himself and tucked a strand of her hair behind her ear before laying down nearby to rest. When the pair awoke the following morning, they had been sponsored a small feast of food, to their bewilderment. Zibbeline asked in confusion if this gift had been meant for someone else, but Holland shook his head and seemed to realize that it had been sent because of his display of affection the previous night. He encouraged his district partner to dig in as she continued to express her confusion at the 3 platters of meats, cheeses, fruits, and vegetables provided, stating that she had no idea why anyone would sponsor her after storming out of her interview and insulting Rosalia. The pair felt much stronger the next morning after eating, yet were still concerned that they had fallen asleep before making a coherent action plan or knowing which tributes were still alive at this point in the games. Among the deceased from the second day were both tributes from 1, Torius from 2, both tributes from 5, Montpellier from 6, Amber from 9, Murray from 10, Pepper from 11, and Gabriel from 15. Another crashing was heard the following morning, revealed to be yet another unoccupied Black Rook building. Wolfram perked up from the Three's hideout in the stairwell, narrowing his eyes in deep thought and only snapping back to the present when he heard Tinker stirring behind him. She sleepily reached into her jumpsuit pocket as if reaching for a stuffed animal, and suddenly let out a scream, tossing something out. Wolfram jerked around to see what was going on, only to see one of the tiny mechanized chess pieces from the shelf room clicking and squeaking as it skittered around the floor. The piece, a white bishop, was quickly captured by Wolfram, who along with Tinker peered at it in the dim and dusty light filtering into the room from far above them. Tinker quickly pointed out the small notch dashed across the piece's front and ran a finger along its length. Suddenly, she gasped in surprise and pressed the piece into Wolfram's hands before sprinting back up the staircase and returning with the entire puzzle box she had cracked earlier, which was full of small, whirring chess pieces. Setting the box down on the ground, she squinted through her visor at the unusual locking mechanism affixed to the door. Instead of a conventional lock that required a key to operate, it contained a tiny hollow at the center and more indentations fanning out in a pattern reminiscent of sun rays. On a hunch, muttering something about wondering what Lena was trying to tell them by sending the chess piece, Tinker began to place the pieces within the indentations, though she seemed confused as to which piece belonged in the central indentation. Wolfram helped her, but the pair quickly found that the pieces could not just be placed anywhere and had to be specifically wedged into certain parts of each ray, where a satisfying click would be admitted if they were placed correctly. The white bishop piece from Tinker's pocket ended up fitting snugly into the topmost ray, while strangely enough, one of the white knight pieces fit in the center. As soon as they had locked all of the pieces into the correct indentations, they stood back and watched with excitement as the mechanism twisted into the door and swung open. Wolfram high-fived Tinker, though he carefully observed the pattern they had made before they stepped out through the door. Holland and Zibbeline awoke on the third day with alert minds and full stomachs, finally able to think clearly about their plans going forward. Zibbeline suggested that they split up in order to cover more of the tunnels, though Holland appeared to have a realization and shook his head in reply, stating that his ankle still felt weak and he needed her assistance to walk through the tunnels. She sighed and reluctantly agreed to support him as they explored each of the 6 tunnels. The leftmost tunnel led to a dead end several feet in, while the second tunnel was blocked off by rubble that Holland identified as possibly belonging to one of the collapsed buildings. Zibbeline tried to shift some of this rubble, but found it immensely difficult due to both having to support Holland and the sheer amount of rubble blocking the exit. They awkwardly shuffled back to the clearing and tried the third tunnel, finding a door at the end with a special locking mechanism, though this one had a backlit plaque underneath it. Zibbeline deposited Holland in front of this door, tired from holding him up, and told him to figure it out while she inspected the remaining 3 tunnels. In the fourth tunnel, she found another dead end, and the fifth contained a door at the end that seemed blank and inaccessible from the inside, though it seemed possible that it opened from the outside. She stepped into the sixth tunnel and immediately gasped before running back to the third tunnel. Holland, who had been trying to read the plaque, quickly asked why she appeared so worried, to which she replied that she had heard voices coming from the sixth tunnel that sounded like other tributes. Holland wondered aloud how other tributes could possibly have entered the building, but Zibbeline shushed him and told him that they needed to be quiet and hide. Pressing themselves against the wall next to the door, they heard the voices grow louder, and Holland whispered to his district partner that it sounded like they were the pair from 4, Rudolph and Tana. He then clamped a hand over Zibbeline's mouth to mask her heavy breathing, as she seemed frightened to be enclosed into such a small space in the corner of the tunnel and deeply unnerved by the situation. They saw 2 shadows pass by in front of the tunnel, but they were facing outward toward the way the pair from 8 had entered the clearing and soon breathed sighs of relief. The pair then turned back to the plaque in front of them, and Zibbeline recalled the phrase from the previous plaque. They recalled that the other plaque had told them they needed to get to the crown, but there was nothing resembling a crown anywhere near or on the door. Holland read aloud the second plaque to his ally. "You've come this far, the queen is next. To open the door, find the hidden text." The pair scanned all around the plaque and felt around the walls, poking their heads in every corner and even head-butting each other accidentally. As they continued to search, the cameras panned back to the pair from 3, stepping through the doorway to the mystery that lay beyond. Almost instantly, they were launched into midair, screaming as a spring in the ground below them bounced around. The tributes landed unceremoniously on a terrace connected to a white knight piece on the other side of the board, where they rolled over for a moment in pain before slowly getting up. Tinker winced as she climbed to her feet, falling back down a moment later and causing Wolfram to leap up to assist her. Rosalia commented that it seemed likely she had sprained or even broken an arm when trying to cushion herself, and that it seemed likely Wolfram would need to support her for at least the rest of the day in the arena. Cautiously, they stepped off the terrace and into the White Knight building itself, marveling at the cold marble walls and the light breeze blowing in from the terrace. The tributes seemed slightly surprised that their eyes were taking several minutes to adjust to the much brighter environment as they stumbled around in the warmly glowing hallway. Unlike the black chess piece buildings, there were windows in this building that offered panoramic views of the other white chess piece buildings and the cornucopia clearing, where Beatrix was lounging on the top of the cornucopia and sunbathing in the faint light coming from a nearby white pawn building. Together, Wolfram and Tinker continued down the hall, tiptoeing as if it was rigged with landmines. At the tunnels, Zibbeline let out a tiny gasp of surprise and excitement as she felt the faint outline of words on the ceiling, laughing that the words had been right above their heads all along. The pair quickly moved to trace the words with their fingers and whispered them aloud as they went along. "Now you made it this far, you may be feeling hopeful. These rhymes are quite bizarre. Remember to push, not pull." Holland and Zibbeline turned to each other in bewilderment and then turned in unison to look at the door. Placing his hands on his head, Holland muttered to his partner that the rhyme was so simple that it had to be referencing a way to open the door. Zibbeline planted her hands on her hips before striding forward and pushing on the door's plain surface as it instantly swung open at her touch. Holland's jaw dropped as he grumbled that the game makers were just taunting them at this point and that he hated push doors with a passion. They stepped through the door and shut it behind them, turning to stare in amazement at the vast room around them. An elegant black marble chamber lay ahead, appearing to be some kind of basement with a spiral staircase on the other side. The tributes' footsteps echoed quietly throughout the chamber as they continued to stare and made their way up the spiral staircase, Zibbeline allowing Holland to lean on her for support due to his injured ankle. This building was clearly much more luxurious than any of the other black chess piece buildings they had been in so far in Chess City, leading Holland to snarkily remark that perhaps it belonged to the mayor. At the top of the staircase was another door, which opened easily, as Zibbeline grumbled that she was growing quite tired of doors. The door revealed a circular chamber furnished entirely in gleaming black marble, lined with doors, and another grand spiral staircase in the middle of the atrium. Strangely, unlike the other black chess piece buildings, this building was well lit by torches on the walls and had small windows placed throughout each of the airy chambers to allow more dim light from the other side of the arenas to seep in. Zibbeline observed to her partner that they were most likely in the Black Queen building, as that had seemed to be their vantage point through the windows. Rosalia Sanchez confirmed this on her live coverage show. Holland and Zibbeline poked their heads into each room, finding nothing but empty space and the occasional chair or table, before proceeding up the central spiral staircase. It was much taller than they thought, and the pair were both out of breath by the time they reached the top. As they arrived at the chamber that lay above, they exhaled in excitement. Ahead of them was a striking throne room, empty save for a single black marble throne with a shining dark sword resting across its polished armrests. Holland and Zibbeline glanced at each other for a moment before both of them dived for the sword. Meanwhile, Tinker and Wolfram had just begun to explore the White Knight building when they heard a cannon ring throughout the arena. Maple, from 7, had finally succumbed to extreme thirst and hunger after not being sponsored any food or water, and his body was removed from another white chess piece building by a hovercraft. Beatrix called out "Toodles" and waved the hovercraft away from her lounging spot on the cornucopia while twirling around her rook chess piece weapon, to the horror of the pair from 3. They scampered down a short series of staircases at the end of the white hallway and found themselves on a small plaza at the side of the building. Suddenly, a great rumbling echoed around them in the dark arena, and the entire White Knight building they were in began to collapse. Tinker screamed, inadvertently alerting Beatrix to their location, while Wolfram looked around worriedly. Beatrix grinned sharply, sliding off the cornucopia and proceeding over to the dazed pair amid the outside of the rubble. Wolfram rubbed his head and seemed intrigued by the fact that the building had collapsed, though he was still too dizzy to notice Beatrix until she stabbed her rook weapon into the rubble, inches from his skull. He yelped and struggled to free himself from under a chunk of chalky marble, but his leg was trapped. Tinker wiggled around nearby, wincing as she tried to slip out from between 2 large blocks of rubble. Beatrix leaned back and giggled, clearly enjoying the show as the 2 tributes flailed around. She withdrew her weapon once again from the marble rock and rapped Wolfram sharply on the head with it, to his annoyance, as if she were a strict teacher berating a schoolboy. Just as Beatrix leaned back to recline and debate which of them to behead first, there was a great swishing noise and she rolled to the side. Embedded in Beatrix's shoulder was a black pawn piece, a small silver blade protruding from it into her back. She roared in outrage and turned to see the pair from 4, cousins Rudolph and Tana, standing behind the ruins of the building and aiming more pawn-piece knives at Beatrix with cold smiles. Beatrix gritted her teeth and removed the knife from her shoulder with only a slight grimace, leveling it at them along with her longer rook sword. There was a moment's tense pause as Tinker and Wolfram's eyes darted back and forth between the 2 factions. Then, as our analysts noted in their original review of this footage, all hell broke loose. Beatrix dived at Rudolph and Tana, taking them both down to the ground with her as they stabbed at her with their knives. The 4s were quick-witted, but Beatrix had the advantage of her surprise tackle and the finest training District 2 could offer. In under a minute, Beatrix had knocked all of their knives aside and pinned each of them to the ground with both her hands amid their struggles, standing with one foot on each of their chests and slowly choking them. She appeared to relish this greatly as she squeezed the life out of them, sounding both their cannons at once. Beatrix lightly kicked their bodies, sending them rolling a few inches across the chessboard floor before the hovercrafts arrived to scoop up their limp bodies. Beatrix then turned back to the rubble and ran a finger along her bloody rook sword, eyes shining with delight. However, her excitement turned to fury a moment later as the 3s were nowhere to be seen. The camera zoomed over to across the cornucopia clearing, where the pair had freed themselves and were skittering towards the rear of the black side of Chess City. Beatrix growled and kicked a nearby chunk of rubble in frustration, though this only resulted in an injured toe for her. As Wolfram and Tinker continued to run, Tinker gingerly propping up her injured arm with her free arm, Wolfram hurriedly explained to her that the reason he had apparently been zoning out after each of the building crashes was because he had realized something important along the way, a pattern that he believed held some significance in determining which pieces fell. She peered at him through her visor, eyes wide in curiosity, as he explained that from what he knew of chess, the game makers had to be playing some sort of chess game in which each captured piece corresponded to the real game they were playing in the control room. Tinker gasped and nodded in agreement, replying that it had seemed unusual that it was very specific buildings that had collapsed, and that some of them had not even contained any tributes within them, which would have appeared counterintuitive if the game makers wanted to kill off tributes through arena events. Rosalia Sanchez interjected at this time to confirm Wolfram's theory and clarify that it represented the War Horseman, showing footage from a few minutes before then of 2 game makers enjoying a lighthearted match in the control room. The game maker playing for the black side captured a white knight piece and knocked it off their chessboard. They then leaned over to the live arena map in the center of the control room and flicked a holographic projection of the same chess piece building over, resulting in the camera footage on the control room walls revealing the very building crash that had trapped Wolfram and Tinker. Tinker beamed at Wolfram and ruffled his hair with her good hand, clearly proud of her district partner for figuring out the pattern. Wolfram nodded sullenly and replied that according to his knowledge of chess, the best move for the black side to make next would be to capture a white pawn to help clear the way for an attack by its other pieces, though he said its position was strong. Almost at this exact moment, a white pawn behind them toppled over, narrowly missing Beatrix and the rubble of the White Knight building. Beatrix howled in fury and sprinted over to the black side, seemingly believing the pair from 3 had escaped to one of the other white chess piece buildings and were taunting her by rigging buildings to fall. Searching around wildly, Wolfram and Tinker darted into a nearby black rook building and sprinted up a single long staircase inside until they reached the top, where the castellated roof allowed them a bird's-eye view of the other buildings and Beatrix sprinting between them. They put their heads together to try and formulate a plan to trap Beatrix, but they failed to notice that she had stopped in the middle of the alleyway between the rook and a black pawn building and was staring up at their figures with a glint in her eye, visible even through her visor. Inside the throne room, in the Black Queen building, Zibbeline and Holland grappled for control of the dark, gleaming sword with an ornate silver handle that lay across the front of the throne. However, Zibbeline easily wrenched the sword away from her district partner, which many viewers and commentators suggested was due to Holland's weakened ankle continuing to cause him pain after he had been putting pressure on it while it was sprained. She triumphantly held the sword in the air, though Holland flinched and asked if she was planning to use it on him. She simply shrugged and reminded him that there were bigger targets to hit first, curling her lip. Holland weakly laughed and asked if she was referring to Beatrix, though they both burst out laughing a moment later as Zibbeline asserted that Beatrix's head was so full of air that she doubted a sword would even slice through it. Holland asked if they should leave the throne room or stay put, to which Zibbeline casually replied that it would likely be in their best interest to stay put for the time being. Holland shrugged and limped over to the throne to sit down, falling asleep within just minutes, as Zibbeline ate some of their remaining food and sat down on the floor near the throne to rest. Back outside, Wolfram adjusted his visor on his face and turned to continue discussing a plan of action with Tinker, only to cry out in horror as he witnessed a small trickle of blood running down from her mouth and a vacant expression on her face. Without a sound, she silently fell forward, a chess-piece knife embedded in the back of her neck. Wolfram began to weep, sinking to the ground and clutching Tinker's head in his arms with what little strength he could muster. She seemed to be faintly muttering something, but it was unintelligible to both Wolfram and the audience, until Wolfram gently turned her head up to the sky. The words, "Give 'em hell, chessman," crossed her lips along with a tiny smile, before her head lolled back. A cannon rang out in the distance. Wolfram stood, his face obscured by shadow, as a hovercraft arrived to pick up Tinker's body, and he saw Beatrix on the ground, grinning her gleeful grin as usual. She skirted over to the Black Rook building and entered it, as Wolfram continued to stand frozen on the roof. He could hear Beatrix's faint footsteps and labored breathing on the stairs below, yet he remained perfectly poised at the center of the rooftop. Some viewers in Mace Square shouted at him to climb down the side of the building, while others who supported Beatrix hastily shushed these audience members. Wolfram turned, his face finally becoming partially visible in the dim arena light, and angled a cruel smile toward the girl approaching from the stairwell. As Beatrix rounded the top of the stairs and stepped out onto the roof, eyes wild with the thrill of the chase, Wolfram began to laugh. She growled and asked why he was behaving so recklessly and annoying her when she was about to kill him anyway, to which he replied that he knew something she did not. Beatrix put her hands on her hips and demanded that he tell her what was so funny, to which he replied, still laughing hysterically, that the building they were on top of was the next to collapse. Confusion flashed across Beatrix's face as Wolfram calmly declared Kavalek versus Kasparov, one of the classics, and explained to an increasingly more bewildered Beatrix that at this point in a match he had studied from the old days of chess, the white rook had claimed the black rook, thereby setting up black for a solid checkmate. In simple terms, he continued, gesturing wildly, the building was about to blow, and they were directly in the line of fire. Beatrix raised an eyebrow skeptically, unwilling to believe such a ludicrous tale, but Wolfram smiled darkly, raising his arms and embracing the deep guttural rumbling that followed just a moment later. Just as he had predicted, the Black Rook building immediately toppled over, with both tributes swept up in a haze of dust and collapsing rubble. The last thing viewers saw was Wolfram's smug grin and Beatrix's skepticism turning to pure horror, as 2 more cannons sounded amid the settling rubble. Instantly afterward, an unoccupied white rook and a black knight collapsed too, confusing many viewers. The 3 cannons ringing within just minutes of each other, and the loud building collapses had startled Zibbeline and Holland out of their respective slumbers in the throne room, and they both leaped to their feet, though Holland winced. His eyes widened in shock as he did some quick mental math and told Zibbeline that he believed this meant that they were the final 2 tributes. She turned to him in surprise and stared with almost a tinge of fright. It was clear to viewers that neither of them had expected to make it to the end together. She glanced down at the sword in her hands, then over at the unarmed Holland, and inhaled shakily before leveling it at him. Holland shook his head and put out his hands, imploring her to wait. Zibbeline furrowed her brow and asked why, to which he replied that he had something he wished to say before she killed him. She nodded slowly, lowering the sword slightly to allow him to speak. Holland knelt before her and quietly told Zibbeline that he loved her. sparking gasps and several spontaneous bouts of tears from Capitol citizens and district citizens alike. However, Zibbeline did not buy into this and glared, coolly declaring that he was just saying this to distract her and let her guard down. He shook his head fervently in response and asked her to look into her eyes, which she did with a degree of reluctance. As both Zibbeline and all of Panem softened for a moment, realizing that he was clearly either telling the truth or bluffing very well, he admitted that she had grown on him since the start of the games and that he had truly enjoyed every moment they spent together. Holland took Zibbeline's hand in his and pressed his lips to it, raising his head and asking softly if they could take a stand and try to threaten a win together or lose as a couple by killing themselves together. Zibbeline melted at the gentle touch of his hands clasping hers, as viewers stirred with excitement and hopefulness that the couple would be able to win together. Instead, her warm and earnest look flashed away and froze into a cold and calculating glance as she cast aside his hand, stepped backward, and plunged the sword into his chest with all her might. Holland gasped and crumpled to the floor, his eyes watering in an apparent combination of pain and heartache as blood spilled from his body onto the polished floor. With his last few wheezing breaths, Holland angrily remarked that the arena was a chess game, and in chess, the queen should not kill her own king. Zibbeline gave a small smile in return and remarked, "But the Hunger Games isn't chess." She then apologized for killing him, before quietly remarking that she loved him too, but that she loved staying alive and winning more. Zibbeline stepped over his body and ascended to the throne in the center, seating herself on it with a queenly grace and tossing her hair behind her back as a cannon sounded. The extremely startled head game makers Lock and Lock hastily announced over the loudspeaker that Zibbeline Charvet of District 8 was the victor of the 110th Hunger Games, to the shock of nearly every viewer across Panem, who were all in total awe at the scene they had just witnessed and Holland's body being collected from the throne room as Zibbeline was airlifted through a window from the throne room to safety. Behind her, the White King building on the other side of Chess City disintegrated, an homage to the victory of the Black Queen. Zibbeline was checked for injuries and found to have only sustained some cuts and bruises, thereby clearing her to partake in the post-victory events. Right from the time of her victory, Zibbeline proved unpopular with the capital, especially because of its citizens' tendency to pronounce her name wrong and her ongoing feud with Rosalia Sanchez. Rosalia arrived for the victor's interview in a black and white two-tone dress and irritably introduced a very grumpy Zibbeline as Zibline, which the victor called out from the backstage sounded more like Zipline than her actual name. Rosalia then introduced her as simply Zib, which annoyed the victor even more as she clenched her fists and shouted to not call her that name. She stomped out onto the stage in an ill-fitting black marble dress and grumbled that Rosalia looked more like a purse than a person in her dress, triggering a mix of indignant muttering and nervous laughter in the crowd. The rest of the interview was marred by the awkward interactions between victor and interviewer, especially when Zibbeline pointed out that she found the quell twist stupid and rigged, despite Rosalia's assertions that she believed it was a justified quell considering the crimes committed by the tribute's relatives. Once again, Zibbeline refused to complete the interview and stormed off the stage to mixed boos and cheers from the audience. Rosalia seemed for once more relieved than sad to be seeing off a victor from the interview stage, and cheerfully called in head game makers Lock and Lock for their yearly discussion of the games. Head game makers Lock and Lock revealed that this year's arena had been one of the most difficult to create, which was why they would be returning back to basics next year. Rosalia quirked an eyebrow, but for once did not ask about the following year's arena, clearly having learned by now that the game makers would not give anything away. She thanked them for their time, and they exited the stage in perfect coordination, amid whoops and cheers. Returning home to District 8 after her victory, Zibbeline was hailed as an unlikely hero by her district, despite the capital's general dislike of her poor attitude. As mentioned previously in File 108, which referenced the much more extensive File 23A Unity Efforts Overview, President Mace launched a careful plan to keep Zibbeline under control and avoid any potential rebellious behavior on her part. Announcing over an urgent Capitol TV address that since it was about time that well-known figures in Panem began showing their district unity and pride in the third incarnation, two victors from recent years would be married on live television in front of Panem in a public broadcast to celebrate and symbolize cooperation and unity between the districts. Many citizens immediately began speculating on which victors would be involved, with many believing Celia Barrett and Mercury Valens, or Austin Clark and Lena Siragon, to be announced as the special pair, until President Mace made a special appearance with a defeated-looking Zibbeline Charvet on Rosalia's evening program shortly after the conclusion of the victory tour to announce that she would be marrying none other than Oakley Barbosa, victor of the 108th Games. At once, Zibbeline's jaw dropped and she gritted her teeth, appearing to be stuck between tackling President Mace to the floor and bursting into tears. Oakley's face was shown on camera back in District 7, glowering with bloodshot eyes and appearing just as shocked as Zibbeline. Capitol citizens cheered wildly, thrilled to hear about the wedding announcement and quickly becoming absorbed in all things related to the preparations from that evening on. The happy couple were to be styled by Camillo Anderson himself for the wedding. However, they were not permitted to see each other before the wedding day, and it was reported that Zibbeline had to be returned by peacekeepers after attempting to escape the rehearsal dinner at a Capitol hotel by throwing a banana cream pie at a security guard and vaulting over the bar out into the hallway. She later attempted to bribe an AVOX at her dress fitting to take her place, but this was quickly found out when a reporter asked her what her opinion of a dress was, and she was unable to answer, instead appearing quite trapped and skirting away to the restroom. Oakley's reaction to the news was just as shocked and repulsed as Zibbeline, though there was much more coverage of the bride-to-be than her groom during the wedding preparations. On the day of the wedding, which was to take place at the luscious Sickle Park in the Capitol, all of Panem gathered in person or at the televisions back in their districts to watch the special Capitol TV broadcast of the event. As they watched, transfixed, Zibbeline stiffly stepped out from a limousine in a flowing white dress, her dark hair twisted into a loosely pinned bun at the back of her head, and clutching a bouquet of white roses so tightly that her knuckles were as white as the flowers. What viewers could not see, tightly wrapped around her left ankle under the voluminous dress, was the ankle tracker rigged to electrocute her in the event of any unwanted behavior. Slowly, she shuffled down the aisle amid the buzzing audience of prominent Capitol citizens decked out in garish white makeup for the occasion, appearing to be taking a death march rather than her wedding procession. As she raised her head and approached the stage, the tiniest of tears streaked down her cheek, though her face remained passive and blank. Oakley tried to offer a small, reassuring smile to Zibbeline, but they both quickly looked away from each other a second later and stared at the ground. The rest of the victors of the third incarnation so far were also present at the event, though none of them appeared particularly excited to be there except for Mercury Valens, who had smuggled a bottle of champagne from the reception and occasionally took a furtive swig of it when she thought no one was paying attention. President Mace himself was in attendance, and he smiled indulgently down at the bride and groom from his special viewing location on the balcony of a nearby luxury hotel. As the officiant completed the ceremonial recitations and Oakley and Zibbeline were prompted to say their I do's, a pair of peacekeepers inched forward from behind the stage and subtly tapped the butts of their rifles against the ground, making a small clicking noise that was not lost on the soon-to-be wedded pair. Gritting their teeth with obvious discomfort, they exchanged tense vows and rings. The Capitolites in the crowd applauded and cheered wildly as the newlyweds turned around to face the music and were greeted by blasting confetti cannons. Oakley flinched and carefully took Zibbeline's hand, from which she jerked away but inhaled sharply a second later and accepted. Those who were looking closely could see that her ankle tracker had given her a shock. Suddenly, as the happy couple began to proceed back down the aisle to be escorted to the reception, there was a shout of alarm and a crack. All attention turned to the pair of peacekeepers that had been behind the bride and groom on the stage, and a chorus of screams a moment later as many realized that these peacekeepers had just fired at Dominus Doolittle, a prominent Capitol diplomat seated in the fourth row. As he slumped in his seat, a steady trickle of blood streaming from his temples and drenching his white suit with scarlet red, the peacekeepers fired again at several other figures among the guests. By this time, other security at the event had sprung forward amid the burgeoning chaos and the screaming Capitolites trying to take cover under their chairs, while the victors were hurriedly evacuated from the front rows by more peacekeepers. The rogue peacekeepers were quickly apprehended and tased by security after splattering several more white suits and gowns with the blood of their wearers, as the newlyweds stood frozen in the aisle. Other peacekeepers ripped the helmets off the betrayers, revealing them to be the political figures we now know to be Michel Dupont and Louis-François Helmholtz, members of an early resistance force in District 15 that had stowed away on a hovercraft returning to Panem after making a supply drop-off in their home district and disguised themselves as peacekeepers. As a swarm of real peacekeepers descended upon them and subdued them, the cameras were too focused on capturing the carnage to notice that the bride was staring at the intruders with a strange expression on her face, almost a mix of relief and fear. Oakley urgently tapped Zibbeline on the shoulder, gesturing at a pair of nearby peacekeepers that were waving them over to be evacuated from the event along with the rest of the guests, but she held up a finger to indicate she needed a moment and shouted something over the commotion, apparently directed at the rogue peacekeepers. With our technology and ability to reconstruct audio, we believe she spoke in French to Michel Dupont, saying, "Michel, ne le laissez pas terminer à la chambre blanche," though this exclamation was quickly cut off by a peacekeeper grabbing her arm and that of Oakley as well, dragging them away from the scene. It was only several hours later, after all the wedding guests had been evacuated to the Mace mansion, The reception rescheduled till the following day, and the bride and groom as well as the other victors lodged in an unspecified safe house, that everyone was cleared to return home. Capital TV blamed the security breach at the wedding on a personal grudge held by the two peacekeepers against certain prominent individuals, as it was noted only wealthy and influential diplomats were targeted, and did not publicly disclose that the trespassers were from District 15. The event was then termed the Wretched Wedding from there on out and constituted a major shift in the capital's security procedures. President Mays privately ordered that only the most elite peacekeepers with the finest training be sent to District 15 instead of any that might stand a chance of being hijacked by local rebels, and for there to be more comprehensive screening of all shipments to and from the districts. Oakley and Zibbeline were installed at a new home in the capital to allow for heavy surveillance of their activities. Although it was reported in multiple primary sources that they were not the most compatible couple, they still bore a son, Amir, during the year of the 115th Hunger Games. Their son would later go on to be reaped into a future games. Thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Panem Reborn, File 110, the second quinquennial quell of the third incarnation, and I hope you were able to enjoy the lore that I put in at the end. So yeah, again, as I said earlier, after next week's upload, I'm going to be taking a break for mental health, but I'm really appreciative of all the support that I've received so far, and I'm very grateful for that, so thank you so much, and I hope you'll continue to support the series in the future, and I can't wait. So thank you guys so much, and I don't think there's anything else I have to say other than please join the Discord. I promise Zibbeline Charvet is not holding a chess piece weapon to my head. And yeah, that's it. So Panem today, Panem tomorrow, Panem forever.